Hello and welcome to Deep Roots, the podcast brought to you from Oak Hill College, where we have conversations about theology and ministry. My name is Tim Ward and I'm one of the lecturers here, and I'm joined today by Drs. Sidney Tooth and David Shaw, who both teach New Testament and Greek here. And we're talking John's Gospel, which I've preached on from time to time, but both of you teach courses on it here. So it's going to be great to hear from you lots about John's Gospel. Now, of course, John's Gospel, there is so much we could talk about. We could have multiple episodes on this. Just tell us which particular topics we're going to focus in on today.
We are going to spend some time looking at characterization in John and get into a bit of reading John alongside the Johannine epistles as well.
Tim, we threw out a few different topics. You liked the thought of characterization and thought that would be a helpful thing given how we sometimes approach John.
Yeah, that's true. Here's a question that in rehearsal, David, I was going to ask you and you've thrown back at me. No, nice move. I can see you coming. But it's fine. Characterization. I mean, it's true, isn't it? In the last 30, 40 years in gospel scholarship, but actually scholarship right across biblical narrative, there's been quite a move to think about how characters work within the narrative. I guess within the broad heading of narrative criticism. And is that true? That's been a move in the last 30, 40 years?
Yeah, so Alan Culpepper, Anatomy of the Fourth Gospel, is probably the kind of, I think that's the first big salvo. And that's a bit of a move away from trying to think about John's Gospel as a historical text to trying to think about how we take apart the text and think about the communities that were behind it, and instead to read the text as a literary artifact and to think about some of those categories of plot and character. Yeah,
I guess, and the way preaching and teaching and ministry from Gospels is sometimes thought about in regard to the characters is you've kind of got two choices. You can do character study, or you can do, well, I'm just going to expound this text as the text that it is. I'm interested in your comments from each of you on this. I mean, my sense is that thinking about how characters work actually within the warp and woof of the narrative itself can help just kind of cut through that and show that it's not necessarily one or the other. And actually to expound the text without paying good attention to character, if the characters are strongly part of the narrative, seems like a false choice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, if you're just focusing on it as character study, you're missing actually how John has woven in each of the characters and what's he doing with them. What is he trying to get out of his reader by having these different characters? And actually by focusing on characterization, you can see the development of his narrative. You can see what responses he might be trying to get us to have to each character and how they're portrayed.
Yeah, that's right. I think the John very often is doing. There are passages in John where so much of the work that he's doing in thinking how to form us, how to help us understand the significance of Jesus, is by presenting really quite close character studies. It's where John's Gospel stands out in some ways. One of the ways in which it stands out from the other Gospels, the way in which he will do lengthy scenes where you've got Jesus interacting with a particular individual or an individual on their own interacting with others and Jesus absent even for a time. So yeah, that seems significant. I suppose one of the concerns about the thought of just doing character study that people might raise would be that it there's that famous Tim Keller clip that used to do the rounds a lot, that the gospel isn't about you. It's not about you putting yourself in the shoes of this character or that character and being the hero or being the villain or something.
It's not about you, it's about God, so preach God.
Right. There's something surely helpful in that. There's something really helpful in not just thinking, where do I fit in this story, without thinking about what story this is telling about God and his relation to us and so on. And there are certainly, I think, parts of the Gospels or other places where to be too preoccupied with which character I'm supposed to be identifying with here would be a distraction. And yet, in so much narrative, John's Gospel in particular, that's really the way in which we're invited to read, it seems to me.
Yeah, there's a quote I really like on this from a man called Daniel Doriani. He's written a nice book on application. So he's actually in context just talking about application for Scripture as a whole, but I think it applies quite nicely here, where he says, in a narrative, look for the action of God and the responses of people to that action of God as it comes into their reality and into their lives. And that, it seems to me, I mean, it's a simple thing to say, but it nicely shows you, if we are preaching what the text says about God, we are also going to be preaching what the text shows us about human reactions and responses to that divine action in the text, because that's how God has chosen to narrate it to us.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, David, it is distinctive in John that you have these long individual scenes with characters as well. And you introduced me to a book chapter by Bauckham about individualism within John's Gospel.
Yeah, this is Richard Bauckham.
Yes,
good writer.
a really, really helpful chapter, just actually looking at what it means that Jesus meets each of these characters in their own context and situation, and what that means for the reader too, about thinking about how do we individually encounter Jesus as well.
I mean, would you recommend that book if someone wanted to chase these things up further?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a collection of essays called Gospel of Glory, and inside there's a chapter called Individualism. Yeah, it's one of my favourite reads on John. Really helpful. Where if you hear individualism talked about in a lot of evangelical churches, generally it's a pretty negative thing. We want to avoid individualism. Bauckham's quite helpful to say there's a right kind of individualism that comes through. Actually, to see Jesus' encounters with individual people says individuals matter to Jesus. You see him interacting countlessly with men and women in different circumstances. There's something there of God's individual care, where he knows his sheep by name. You see that worked out in the way that he interacts with individuals. But then the gospel doesn't just leave us as individuals. It does provide, the gospel provides the power to draw us out from any sort of isolated, egotistical sort of individualism into a community of love, but one in which we don't lose our individuality. We're not just absorbed into some mass either. So Bauckham's reflecting on all of that, which is a really helpful thing, I think.
That's tremendous. Yeah, anything I read Richard Bauckham having written about, he's always thought about it way harder than most other people, even if you don't agree with him. Yeah, terrific. Okay, well, if that's characterization in general, David, you just got there a little bit into some of the specifics of John's characterization. So let's dive in. Sydney, you wanted particularly to talk about chapter 4, didn't you?
Yes, yeah.
So kick us off with that.
I mean, there's so many different characters you could look at. I'm trying to remember how many individual interactions there are. But the Samaritan woman is one of the, I think, most distinctive ones. So in John 4, you have Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman by the well. I think why I wanted to talk about it and think about it a bit is actually thinking about history of interpretation. So how have we treated that? I don't know what your experiences of hearing it taught and preached in churches are, but mine has been quite often she's got this very sinful past, and
it's all climaxing in you've had a lot of blokes in your life, and this is the problem.
I think what's helpful in going through it and actually seeing how is Jesus responding to her, what's John pulling out as well as he's portraying it. It's helpful to step back and think, well, what are we reading in that's not there? I think thinking about this idea of her being sinful or having all these husbands, that doesn't seem to be Jesus's focus, and it doesn't seem to be John's focus. It's just even thinking about the cultural background of it is, well, if a woman has had all these husbands in that time period, it's likely she's been abandoned, rather than that she's just a loose woman flitting from one man to another. And so starting to get behind that a bit, I think, is really helpful. But also just thinking, what images are there? So you've got the image of the well, and that kind of touches into some of John pulling out Old Testament imagery and things too. But wells have this betrothal scene idea behind them. You have Jacob's well is probably in view here, and it's picking up on language we've already had in John as well. You've had John 2, the wedding at Cana. You have in John 3:29, John the Baptist has just said, I'm like the bridegroom's friend preparing the way. And so this is sort of preparing the way for us to start seeing some further betrothal, bridegroom, Jesus as the bridegroom imagery. So how that works with the Samaritan woman is if she's representing Samaria and Jesus is a man from Judea coming, and this is a betrothal scene of the two of them coming together. This is Mary Collow's done a lot of work on this, of actually this is the uniting of the two kingdoms again, the north and the south coming together, Jesus making his people one.
The dialogue does end with her stressing, doesn't it? You Jews and you Jews worship there, we Samaritans worship here. That's quite strong towards the end.
Yeah, that's right. So there are lots of clues that build up to that sort of characterization of Jesus as the bridegroom. So by the time you get to John 4, in the ways that Cindy said, he's been developed as the bridegroom. To have that scene set up with the well and the seeking after water. If you're familiar with lots of those narratives from Genesis of people seeking brides, then you'd see some parallels there, in particular to a noonday scene. So that's particularly reminiscent of the Jacob narrative.
Yeah.
And so there are some hints there that's how these characters might be functioning. When you set the woman next to Nicodemus in John 3, you've got some interesting comparison and contrast. Again, it's one of the ways that John will help you work out what do I make of this character, to set at least some characters up in pairs. Nicodemus, the insider, the kind of heart of the temple and Jerusalem establishment, the Samaritan woman on the edge of things. You've got a man and a woman. You've got a nighttime scene with Nicodemus and a noonday scene with the woman. So you're being invited to see them in their contrasting responses to Jesus, but also in their social status. So the fact that this is a woman, the fact that this is a Samaritan, those things are being highlighted for us as part of the significance. So yeah, that sort of builds that picture.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's setting the scenes. There's sort of what's happening in John 4. If we want to go back to characterization and think about that more specifically, I think the other things that are really interesting is the woman's clearly trustworthy. That she goes back to the town, tells the townspeople, I've found this man who's told me everything I've ever done. Come see him, and they all come out. So there is. I think that pushes back at some of this idea that she's very untrustworthy or anything, but actually she is someone that they want to listen to. And then thinking about how characterization works for us as the reader is she seems to be set forward in contrast to Nicodemus as actually this is a good example of discipleship. Is she's heard this. She may not have the full picture, but she's certainly grasped a lot of Jesus's identity, gone back and told people about it, and they come, and there is quite a great response among the Samaritans after that.
So I suppose one of the is this helpful to say? In some ways, everyone is going to do characterization. Everyone is going to read these texts and find some way to draw some conclusions. You have to in John's Gospel to come away with some sense of what is the role of this woman. And as we've said, the history of interpretation is just really mixed in it. Calvin, for example, says, well, she's had 5 husbands. Clearly, then she's argumentative and difficult to live with, as if that's the only kind of way that you might interpret that situation. The ways in which she would be far more vulnerable in the ways that sin is expressed would be just as easy, just as plausible ways to kind of explain her circumstances. But you read it in the context of John and you realise here in some ways is a model response to Jesus. You see, as we said, him interacting with her going away from that and telling her townspeople and being a kind of model witness. So there's something the way in which she's just a model disciple. And that's something that others in historical readings of John have picked up on. John Chrysostom in his sermons on her praises her as a great model of faith. It's a really distinctive emphasis in his stuff. But then, as we've said, it also, as well as just giving you a model response to Jesus, it does also build this picture of Jesus as the one who's come to gather not just Judah but Samaria, and so that openness to a whole variety of
Yeah,
meanings and significances to a story.
Yeah.
It's challenging. It's one of the things I most love about John's Gospel. It's one thing, having been teaching it for some years now, still feels slightly out of grasp. Slightly, there's just always more.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of people's experience, particularly with John's Gospel. Yes, I lately been reading Augustine's sermons on John, and he's also very strong on the Samaritan now represents the foreigner. So this is in effect the marriage of Christ and the church drawn from all nations. He doesn't particularly make much of the bridegroom imagery on the surface, but that's clearly in the background for the way he's interpreting this. A thought that's occurring to me as we're talking about this. So we're talking about potentially some uncertainties around interpretation and characterization. Is it this? Is it that? Or is it explicitly ambiguous? And I mean, just on some practicalities of ministry, someone preparing a Bible study on this, or even just having a quiet time on it, or a sermon or something, is often needing to get something, or they feel they need to get something definite in a very limited number of hours. But with characters, it can often feel like, to what extent is the woman? Might it be that she has been abused by others? But yet she does say, everything I've ever done. And there is a strange tradition that says, no, there is an element in which she's not entirely exemplary, although she then becomes an exemplary witness. So there are all these ambiguities around. How does someone who is not writing a PhD on this passage, but they've got a small number of hours in which to produce some word ministry in which they can't really stand there and go, well, on the one hand and on the other hand, but I don't really know. That's a massive question, but how are we going to go about that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think in John's Gospel, a close reading without a PhD still helps you work out, I think, the significance of the vast majority of characters, in the way that there is clearly some intentional pairing between Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman, the blind man in John 9 being a really clear model witness under fire, testifying to what Jesus has done for him. Not every character is so laden with ambiguity that it's just very hard to make a judgment about it.
Yeah.
Some of the characters, I think, are, and that's really the point. It's not a shortcoming of us and our prep that we haven't been able to clearly identify somebody. So one of the criticisms that's sometimes made about John's Gospel is that it's very black and white. There's light and there's darkness. There's good and there's evil. There's life and there's death. And John does
God's your father or the devil's your father.
Exactly, exactly. It all seems very black and white. And actually what a lot of this characterization does is soften that and acknowledge that actually particular people at particular points in their life are going to be somewhere on that spectrum, are going to be moving a little more towards the light or a little bit more towards the darkness. And that's okay. I think and that's just true to life. So an example would be Nicodemus, who, at least in John 3, is clearly, in his response to Jesus, he's not able to grasp the things that a teacher of Israel ought to be able to grasp. And something of there is something of the night about him, in the sense that he's left in the dark. But come John chapter 7, Nicodemus is there, and he's now the voice pushing back a little bit on the other Jewish leaders and their plans for Jesus and understanding of him. Come chapter 19, he's there, and he's maybe doing more than he knows, but providing some sort of signal of Jesus' worth and kingship in the things that he takes to the tomb. So there's some sense of people make progress. One encounter doesn't tell you everything about somebody. There's just quite a lot about life and ministry to learn from that. Yeah.
Which is maybe a good metaphor for approaching John in general, is at each encounter with John just like all of Scripture. It's you're going to get some things, but not everything from it. And so for the person trying to prepare, it's okay if you're not getting every nuance or every bit of it. Actually, take what you can and go with it, and God is speaking through that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Surely the point to worry about ourselves is if we think we've kind of got John's nuances all sorted out. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Nicodemus there. Actually, just as you were speaking, I remembered reading a book a year or so ago, which I found massively helpful. I think it's called Interpreting Gospel Narratives, and the author did a really nice thing with Nicodemus. It's by a man with a splendid, or nearly splendid name of Timothy Wiarda, Wiarda, which is, he overshoots a great name by 2 letters. You know, you can't have everything. But again, if people want to, anybody watching wants to pick that up, it wasn't terribly expensive, and I found that massively helpful in just doing some very, very careful reading of particularly of characterization.
David, you mentioned the blind man very briefly. I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about characterization of him.
Okay. So we're into chapter 9 here.
We're into chapter 9. Maybe we should play this game later on of like, who's your favourite character in John's Gospel. The blind man, hands down, is my favourite character in John's Gospel. You know, second to Jesus. Again, one of the questions that still revolves around, I remember reading somebody on the significance of anonymity in John's Gospel. If you've got help for me now or later, please do help me. The idea that the most positive characters in John's Gospel are anonymous rather than named is a theory that's got some legs. You think about the beloved disciple, you think about the blind man, you think about the Samaritan woman, whereas you think some of the named characters are more negative in their characterization. Nicodemus, arguably, in contrast to the Samaritan woman, Caiaphas and others. It doesn't work entirely. You've got a Mary and a Lazarus and a Martha and a Peter, but the significance of the blind man, though he's not named, he's given this wonderful long section. In some ways, he stands for all of us. Someone who is brought to sight, and I mean certainly just then your kind of your thought about coming back to John each time and discovering a little bit more sight and God kindly illuminating us a little more. There's a lovely way in which that happens through that narrative, precisely through the trouble he gets in. So he has been healed by Jesus. He's kind of asked to explain this, to defend it, and through that whole process, he grows in confidence. He grows in clarity about who Jesus is, and in lots of ways, he becomes a model for every believer to endure the kind of experience that Jesus prepares his followers for in the upper room. So, there in the upper room, Jesus talks about this time when he's going to be absent. He's going to provide the Spirit. He's going to enable his people to witness and testify to a world that is going to hate them. And I mean, this is some stuff that Peter Lightheart has written really well on, a little book called Deep Exegesis. He asks, why do you get such a long scene there in John 9? Why does the blind man have such time? And why does Jesus disappear for so long? He's absent from the narrative for an extraordinarily long period of time. And it's precisely so that you get this little anticipation of the church's own experience of coming under fire, being called upon to give testimony to Jesus, and experiencing something of the irrationality of those who are refusing to listen to testimony. He says it, his parents say it. Really obvious, this guy has been healed by Jesus. And so there's something just very powerful and wonderful in the way that he presents the calling of the church.
Tremendous. I got so many questions over reading characters, and particularly in John. We're often building, when we're getting to grips with what a text might be telling us and showing us about a particular character, we're piecing a composite picture together out of small details in the text, out of a big picture of the flow of the narrative. And at the same time, because these are people, we are always reading things in. So Sidney, I mean, you quite rightly said with chapter 4, there's a whole tradition of just reading in, she's had 5 men, and so I just, without even thinking about it, I just sort of reach into my cultural view of the world and go, well, she must be this kind of person or that. How do we, what do we have to do more and more to be better readers of how characters are presented to us in Scripture? What are the things we need to do? What are the things we need to be aware of?
That's such a good question, and in some ways, Tim, I'd love to hear what you think about it. Let me throw one thing in, and then let's hear from you guys. John, I think, is particularly rich in symbolism, and that does give you a steer on how to read. So I would feel less confident about our reading of the Samaritan woman if there hadn't been 6 water jars in John 2. So in John 2, the wedding at Cana, you've got Jesus who's going to turn water into wine, and 6 ceremonial water jars are filled up and then turned to wine. The fact that there are 6, again, in John's Gospel, you get so many 7s as a pattern of completeness, and you get a repeated pattern of 6s as signifying something that comes short of that stops short of perfection and completion. So I think as Jesus teaches about the perfect cleansing that he brings, to have 6 stone water jars that bring an incomplete and inadequate sort of cleansing is a striking thing. To then meet a woman who's had 5 husbands, and the man that she's now with is not her husband, which gets you to 6. And then you have a betrothal scene, and she meets Jesus, and he is the Messiah and the bridegroom. Makes you think we've seen again something of a very Jewish heritage, the ceremonial waters that don't cleanse, something of her background, and Jesus bringing the fulfillment and completion of that. So John, in a lot of those details, is I think communicating a lot to us and teaching us, schooling us in paying attention to those details. There are lots of examples I could give you where I'm still not quite sure what to do with this detail or that detail.
Yeah.
But certain patterns emerge. That wouldn't be true for every narrative that you're reading. What would be, Tim, what in your mind would be just some broader guidelines to grow in this habit, this skill? I'm
with you, really. We have to become better and better listeners to the text that is in front of us. And that it's hard to come up with just a blueprint for that, because John writes differently from others. So it's learning to tune our ear to how has he written? How did the Holy Spirit cause him to write as the writer that he was? How has he put down these patterns of symbolism? Now, particularly that will be a challenge for us when there's a way of writing that doesn't come naturally to us because of our cultural background or mindset. And that is where knowing how texts have been interpreted by people from different cultures in the past and different cultures around the world now is enormously helpful. I can remember, this isn't John, this is Luke, but a while ago, sitting with a group of Brits and some people from Africa, reading from Luke 1, Elizabeth and Zechariah. And the Brits immediately assumed that the passage was there to focus on Zechariah and didn't really pick up about what Elizabeth says about shame around disgrace taken away. Because, of course, on the whole, contemporary Brits are not linking childlessness with shame. They'd link unwanted childlessness with grief and sadness, but not with public shame. But the Africans around the table, when asked, what's this about, were just zooming in on Elizabeth, because childlessness in their culture still has an element of public shame around it. So there's an example where just blinded by cultural lenses. So what can we do? Well, I think more as far as we are able, reading commentaries which give some access to the history of the interpretation of passages, but also, and more, as we know, more and more of these are being published now, which give insight into how people from different cultures read this. Because, okay, they will have their own blind spots, but they'll be different from ours, and they will see things that we don't. That's why I think why your Samaritan woman example is such a brilliant one.
Yeah, and I mean, I think kind of picking up on that, some of what I've found really helpful is there have been a few commentaries by some female scholars that have opened some stuff up for me, mainly around the Samaritan woman, but other things throughout John. And so I think that's the same, different gender, different culture, different. If we can be hearing each other's voices on this, that helps us.
Do you want to say a bit more about that? About how female eyes just might approach chapter 4 differently?
Yeah, I think even just if you're reading what Calvin has to say about it, it frankly it hurts actually to think, well, here's a female character interacting with Jesus, and as a woman myself, you think is that really? I'm not sure that's what Jesus is getting at, and so pushing into it a bit and saying, actually, what are the other details there? Now, I should obviously have my own hermeneutics of suspicion against my own reading and my own feelings, but I think, I think it just opens up those questions of, is this actually where the text is going and what it's actually leading into, or is this a result of misogynistic readings or cultural assumptions, and I think that's if we're approaching the text thinking, am I reading something into this? Am I missing something? I think that's a really helpful guard to importing your own ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, lots of these stories are designed to subvert what would be very common expectations of how this story is going to go. And so being alert to that and allowing myself to be surprised and not to insist, I know how this story goes. So, that's you would just expect Nicodemus to give him. It'd be very easy to give him the benefit of the doubt because he's the kind of knowledgeable professional theologian in that sort of setting, and actually what these narratives are very often doing are overturning those sorts of expectations. I mean, the Luke birth narrative is a really nice example of that too, where you've got another real insider. You've got Zechariah there in the temple. His response is unbelief and he's struck dumb. Yeah. Compare that to Mary, who in lots of ways is much less the likely character to respond in that way, not having the advantages that Zechariah does, and yet there is the kind of shining and immediate response of faith. It's beautiful.
This is great stuff. I mean, as you were talking, I mean, I've been interested in characters for a while, from my side of things. As you've been talking, I've been thinking, might it be that one of the reasons why the Lord has given us so many of these narratives with characters in His Word to us, it's a shortish book, and it is His Word for all time, for all peoples. There will be many, many different kinds of character for many, many different kinds of people to see aspects of themselves as a mirror held up to them. And so I'm just being the person I am. I will read some characters better than others, and other people will read other characters better than I do. Which I think, if I'm a preacher or a pastor, that seems to be, I've got to be listening to how, as far as possible, to how a lot of different people who are believers, how they interact with those characters. Sometimes I may think somebody's missed something in the text, but other times I'll hear someone who's just different from me saying, well, I see this, and I would never have thought of it, but there it is, and you look again and go, actually, that really is there.
And so what, just press that a bit further, is the kind of sense then that there's something for everybody? God has given such a kind of gallery of characters that there's somebody for everybody to relate to? Or should am I being pushed to relate to characters who I wouldn't naturally be drawn to? Just
Yes, absolutely. Because it seems to be the relating to characters thing is just happening all the time subconsciously, even if someone kids themselves they're so scientifically, analytically minded that that's not happening. If they are a human being, they are relating to characters, so you might as well acknowledge that you are. Get it out there on the table. And if you're not relating at all, you check your pulse. There might be a problem. And some of that relating, then what do you do? Then you test it by the text. This is my gut reaction in relation to this character, as in, oh my goodness, that's me. Or, oh, I'm really concerned now. I didn't think I was like that, but maybe this is holding up a mirror and I kind of am. Or, this isn't me at all. I don't do that kind of thing. Like, what is this all? Oh, that's obviously her over there, revealing how annoying she is, or whatever it is. Get all that out there on the table, and then just, in light of that, just begin now to ask yourself, is this text revealing things that are true about me that I didn't think were true, but maybe they are? Or this is showing me something about myself, but I'm more like woman in chapter 4 than I am like Nicodemus in chapter 3 as the characters are presented here. But my view of myself that I'm a Nicodemus in the world, not a apparently irrelevant Samaritan woman in the world. So there'll be a holding up a mirror. I now see things about myself, but there will be a pushing. You don't see yourself this way, do you? But actually, the Lord's truth about you is bigger than you would acknowledge. I'm kind of rambling here, but that kind of area. I mean, what sense do you make of that, Sydney?
Yeah, I think that is definitely one way characterization is helpful, and I think even pushing beyond that, it's not even just about understanding ourselves through it either. I think one of the things the different characters in John's Gospel can help with is actually thinking about all the sorts of people you're going to encounter in ministry or in life, and actually their different responses to you talking about Jesus with them is, I think that is a really helpful thing in John, is what you were talking about, the sort of ambiguity and development, and like with Nicodemus moving, it's not just black and white. It's not just you're either a believer or a non-believer. You're not either just in the light or in the darkness. Some people are moving towards the light. Some people move towards the light or seem to, and then move back to the darkness. And I think that's another way of characterization helps us understand what's happening in the world, is actually, okay, I've seen that response in my parish or in my small group. Okay, I kind of have a better understanding of this is how some people are going to respond.
Thank you. That's hugely helpful, what this reveals about others. When I look, we could spend more time on characterization, but we said we're going to shift gear. So shorter time now. John's Gospel in relation to the letters. Somebody kick us off.
Well, we could draw one line straight towards that theme from what we've been talking about so far, which would be just the potential for you to see those sorts of individual responses and reactions in the people that you minister to, as well the opportunity of all of God's people to play their part in themselves, becoming characters, becoming people worthy of imitation and study. In 3 John, that theme comes through really quite clearly, where you've got the language of imitation. John writes there, imitate the good. But either side of that instruction that could be quite abstract, the good in some abstract way, he's actually talking about either being a Demetrius or being a Diotrephes, either being somebody who is a model believer in the way that they extend hospitality and support faithful believers, or somebody who loves to be first, like a Diotrephes. And so one of the lovely things about the letters is you see that same dynamic continuing on of different responses being worked out to the gospel, and the cast of characters extending to John himself in his ministry, to a Demetrius, to a Diotrephes.
Yeah, and so I mean, this is something we talk about in class. Is reading John's gospel alongside the letters, and actually thinking about how do you do that, and how do those go together, and doing some practice and actually reading them together. And I think one of the things you see is at the end of John, you get the statement of, those who haven't seen, blessed are those who haven't seen and believe. Yeah. And the letters move into that territory of working with groups of Christians who have come to believe but weren't there in the upper room with Jesus.
Okay. Yes.
So one of the exercises we did in class was have the upper room discourse from John 13 to 17 read alongside 1 John, and actually thinking about, well, how do those inform each other? How do you think about them? And there was one article we went through by a guy called John Yared. Is that John Yared?
Not sure.
I think you sent it to me.
Okay.
So
I've forgotten a lot of things.
We'll look back and find it. But what he does is he picks up on these themes that are in the upper room discourse in particular, but are also in 1 John, and just sort of put them alongside each other and say, well, how do these help sharpen? I think he has this imagery of reading the two alongside each other is like looking through a diamond. As things become clearer, they enhance each other. And so that's what we tried to do, is how do these enhance each other? And 2 particular themes that really stuck out are, if you break the upper room discourse sort of in half, it's like love of God and then the hatred of the world is 2 big themes.
Yep.
Well, those come out all across 1 John. Is the world hates you, or the hatred of the world, or hating brothers and sisters, and that sort of theme. And actually part of having the upper room discourse and having that right next to 1 John is, well, Jesus said that was going to happen. So for those of you now experiencing this hatred of the world, that shouldn't be a surprise. Jesus said that to his disciples and said this was coming. Let's think back to that and think through what are we promised to help us through that? Well, we have the Holy Spirit with us as we continue to testify to a world that hates Jesus. And so I think 2 and 3 John move into this even more about the kind of practical outworkings of that. But 1 John is picking up on that statement from the upper room discourse in the same way it's picking up on the command to love, a new command I give you, love one another. And what we did in class is think, well, you get statements in 1 John about what that looks like, because this is how we know love. Jesus died for us. If you think back to the upper room discourse in John 13 in particular, one of the examples of love is the foot washing scene. And that is this example of Jesus loving people who are about to betray him and washing their feet, with Judas and Peter with his upcoming denial as well. And so when you have these commands in 1 John of loving one another and loving each other, it's a command to serve in the way that Jesus served, in humble service of each other. So those were a few examples we worked through in class. And you've done a bit on 2 and 3 John and sort of how that takes forward a lot of what happens in John's Gospel too. Actually,
just before, it'd be great to go there. Could I just ask you a bit more? Just reflecting on what's going on there. That's really interesting. So have I got this right? Effectively, what's going on there is, you've got, obviously 1 John, it's not a very long letter, so John doesn't take a lot of time to spell out what he might mean by particular things. You've got these commands, love one another. Now, someone picking that up could preach or teach that and just fill in the content of what it means to love each other in all sorts of ways that just kind of occur to them in the moment. The bee in their bonnet, or the thing that they think their home group needs to really hear that, or something. And what you're doing there is say, well, now read this in light of John's Gospel. And the command, love one another, now comes with a certain content to it. I mean, would you go as far as saying, read those commands in the letter in light of chapters 13 to 17, and that now is the core content of what he means in the letter? Or is it an option for sharpening? I mean, how tightly do you want to read them together?
Yeah, I think it does set the context for it in that if you're going back to the upper room discourse, that is where the command to love is given, and that is where the new command comes from, and so I do think you need that context and that sharpening. Now, I think it can be sharpened and it can be applied, and obviously it's going to look different in different contexts of what that on the ground means, but setting it within the big framework of service, dying to oneself, that following Jesus's example, that's what you see really sharply in John 13 to 17.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So I butted in. You were going on to 2 and 3, John.
No, I think you just you see exactly those same things where in 1 John, in 2 John in particular, you get that repeated love one another command to walk in love. That's what the Father has commanded in 2 John, and that is a lovely way that the Christian life gets distilled down really beautifully and really simply. So I think it's one of the gifts of something like 2 John is to say to God's people, you might have been trained to think that God expects you to do 100 things a day, and that's a measure of success today, and you'll get to the end of your day thinking, I've not managed that many things, or I'm at a stage in life where actually I can just about manage to feed my baby and get the washing done, or my body is now in a state which means I can hardly do anything in a day. For 2 John to take the Christian life and boil it down to love one another and to walk in love, that 3-4 mile an hour pace of doing one thing that the Lord has commanded us to do. There's something really beautiful about the way that gets distilled down. But as Cindy's been saying, John's gospel has to be the way that we interpret what that means so that, as you were saying, Tim, we don't fill that command to love one another with whatever we think that might mean. When John says that, he's relying on everything that's come before in the gospel. This love is a self-sacrificial, costly, love till the end sort of love. And so you need the gospel to understand 2 John and 3 John. 2 John and 3 John help you see some of the benefits of boiling it right down to that. In the end, love one another. But they also, they do help you move into that really contested stage of church life when people are teaching falsely. And so if in the upper room it might feel as if the church is the community of love and the world is this place of hatred, actually 2 and 3 John and 1 John all take you into this territory where, no, there are those who are going to be teaching falsely within the church. And that there's going to be hatred and opposition and division and just ambiguity. Who are the good guys here? Who are the bad guys here? Do you believe, Diotrephes is speaking against Gaius in 3 John. Gaius is speaking about Diotrephes. Who's in the right? Who's in the wrong? Who can you trust? Those letters help you realize all of that great theology of John's gospel comes to land in some of that dust, some of that mess within the church as well as beyond it. And that's something that I would imagine resonates pretty well for a lot of people in ministry.
That's tremendous. Yeah, I like those thoughts. Just as you were talking, all sorts of thoughts were sparking. I mean, in 1 John, they went out from us, but they were not of us. So they seem to be of us, and they're going out should that they weren't. Well, you're straight into that's Judas, isn't it? And is this right in 1 John? The hatred of the brothers and sisters is particularly, it's those who will abandon them and move into error. Which is precisely what Judas does. And it's those who will abide in the faith and abide with one another together in that. And then you're straight into the unity of the church themes, which you get towards the end of the upper room. So that sounds tremendously fertile territory, which we don't have time to explore further now. I give each of you a chance. You may feel you've kind of said all you want to say, which is fine, but on either of the topics we've talked about, characterization or link with the letters, any final thoughts that occur to you that just drop a final bomb before we finish, or a final thought that would take something further?
as you're trying to ask, what is John doing by presenting you with this great cast of characters? We've spoken a lot about it, but maybe one extra thing would be to call you to decision. One of the things that John won't do is let you hide. You do need yourself to come to a decision. You see it in particular with the way that the crowd in John as a sort of character is always fractured. What John does is with the crowd, he'll often tell you, well, within the crowd, some people are saying this and some people are saying that and some people are saying that.
Yeah.
He'll very often end a section like that with a question where somebody's just left a question hanging. Who is this and what sort of person can do this?
Yeah.
And the question just hangs. And so one of the things to pay attention to in all of that is how I'm being invited to make my own decision. I'm to identify with these different responses to Jesus in different ways, but I also need to come to my own decision. And John is calling me to that.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I should have gone first.
You can have that one too if you want, that's fine.
Yeah.
Ditto. I think just I love John. I've had such fun teaching John, really, really digging in, and I think just I think almost more just repeating a point that I've already said of just keep digging in, and that's gonna involve the call to decision. But I think it's gonna help sharpen and enrich your own experience of God's word and who God is, and I think how to share Jesus with others too. I think as you're thinking about different responses and things like that, is actually just thinking about how Jesus met you in your individual circumstance and helping others have that encounter as well.
Wonderful. So much more about John we could say, but this has been enjoyable. Thank you. Great to have you with us for this episode of Deep Roots. We hope there's been good and fruitful things in it for you in your own reading of John's Gospel and ministry from John to others. There'll be a blog coming up in a week or two's time on the Oak Hill website that'll just take one or two of these things around John's Gospel a bit further. We've also been planning the next few episodes. I'm not going to let the cat entirely out of the bag, but we got some very interesting things coming up around the shape of patterns in church services. There's a church nearby here which has done something really interesting. We're going to be thinking around that, plus also more great goodies from the Oak Hill faculty and their tremendous biblical and theological learning. So see you soon.